Yo, what's up, everybody? Mr. Wineland in my house. Yes, I'm in my house. That was the joke. Um, Probably not funny when you have to explain the jokes. We are going to go over World War II with an Oklahoma flavor. What? Since it's Oklahoma history, we're going to talk a little bit about obviously the little bit of history about World War II, but also what was going on specifically in Oklahoma during this time. Um, World War II it's interesting. It's probably one of the more glorified wars in the history of all wars, primarily because a lot of people view it as it's not the last war, but it's definitely the last. It's been the last world war that we've had, in the past 80 some odd years that it's been when it finished. So I mean, and so the world is kind of wanting to ensure, and even after after the war ended, the whole world didn't want this to continue on. They did not want a World War III, is what I'm saying, because at the end of this, I'll explain why. Um, but we're going to talk about how it started and ultimately how is Oklahoma affected by it. So, and it plays a big part. Sorry, why am I yawning? Oh. Anyway, let's go into it. So a lot of the newspapers at the time in Oklahoma in the 1930s, early 1940s were kind of mostly about the Dust Bowl. We talked about it, the Great Depression. Things were not good in Oklahoma. We were still economically struggling with oil and agriculture. But we also see that as this is happening, we have international headlines talking about conflicts going on during the war. And so we see that your answer number 4, by the way, is right here. We see that, as I'll put it in blue for you, that we see certain countries like Japan, Germany, Italy, like the United States, their idea of dealing with the Great Depression was, let's put money into the country. People need resources. Let's get them the resources they need. However, because of Japan, Germany, and Italy situations, it wasn't that easy for them. Like Japan, they're an island. There's only so many resources on that island you can access. So Germany as well, the financial issues after World War One with the European countries basically hitting that country hard financially and really trying to stick it to them, like, haha, you started World War One, so we're going to pay you, make you pay a lot of debt and demilitarize you, and we're going to do all these things, like really kind of pick and poke and prod and really mess with Germany and Italy. They're kind of screwy. They're having some leadership issues, but ultimately they kind of have this dictatorship vibe controlling all these countries, and their way of getting out of the Great Depression was not like, hey, let's maybe help our people out, like, hey, give them a little money here and there. No, it's called, let's get our people to help us take out other people. So that's kind of what it was: expand their borders, gain new resources that way by conquering. Japan, for example, like I said, they're an island. They lack certain resources. So your answer number 5 is everything in blue here. Japan lacks certain basic materials needed to become the world power that they wanted to. So they attacked China as a way to get the access those resources, and so we see this happening during this time. They had an emperor, but their military at this time is gradually taking over control and kind of trying to make the emperor a figurehead. Then we see Adolf Hitler in Germany took charge in 1933, wanting to restore Germany's greatness by regaining lost territory. Adolf Hitler, it's interesting, he got arrested, he got put in prison for trying to lead a socialist group, which ultimately is going to be known as the Nazis, into power during the before World War II. He gets arrested. He writes books. He's doing his art in prison, and he writes Mein Kampf, which is basically going into his life and his ideals. And so when he gets out, he legally becomes the leader of Germany, becoming the chancellor. And eventually, He's a very good speaker. He's able to sway people to his side and his crazy ideas, and ultimately he restores greatness by trying to gain more control of lost territory. He ultimately also too during this time, instead of blaming Germany and taking accountability for their own mishaps, he blames Jewish citizens for their problems. And instead of, blaming Germany on how the leadership for handling their countries going to war in World War I, he blames other citizens. It's their fault. They're the reason why we're in this situation. And then once he gains more and more power, he invades the Rhineland, which is near France, and takes over that area. And then he takes over Austria in 1938, annexing them. By 1940, Germany and Italy have acquired much of the land around their countries, and we see that they ultimately take control of Paris, France. And eventually they take over Dunkirk, which that's a big story. But Hitler, he was a dictator, a person exercising absolute power, unrestricted control of the government. By this point, he's looking to control the world. And so we see what we're going to talk about. When we do eventually go to war in Europe, you see the Allies. You had Great Britain, who was leader Winston Churchill, Russia, Joseph Stalin, United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Axis powers were Germany, Adolf Hitler, Italy, Benito Mussolini, Japan, Hideki Tojo were also the leaders in Japan. So we see that a lot of Americans did not want to go to war. We were just recovering from World War I, the Great Depression, plus we had the influenza breakout. So the idea was we did not want to go to war. We don't want to. No. By 1939, United States is rebuilding their army, rebuilding some of their navy. They do initiate the military draft at this point by 1940. Even though they did not want to go to war, the United States in the back of their mind, Roosevelt's going, look, I'm with the isolationists. I don't want to go to war. I don't want to get caught up with what's going on in Europe. However, we are helping our allies. They're losing. At some point, we're going to have to jump in this thing to help out Russia and Britain. So also during this time, we see that even the United States is dealing with Japan and their aggressions. They're seeing what they're doing to China. They're trying to take over oil exports and really have an influence in certain areas of the Pacific. And the United States is ultimately reducing their oil exports to Japan in hopes to kind of stop Japan from doing what they're doing. But Japan's not doing that. They're basically going, we're getting a little bit more frustrated with the United States because they're restricting our ability to really control the Pacific. So there's negotiations with Japan. They ultimately halt with Japan joining the Axis powers. Eventually, Japan joins the Axis powers with Germany and Italy. And then Hideki Tojo believed that no nation could stop Japan's rise of power, especially in the Pacific. So, because of the oil issues, we're seeing that Japan is going to want to strike the United States. Now, here's the thing. If you really look into the history of the United States, you will see, if you really look into this, especially, sorry, my dog came in, so I had to close the door there. If you really want to look up, there are many individuals within the Japanese Navy that are going, we may not want to do this. We may not want to go after the United States because there's concern of what the reaction will be and how that will motivate the United States. But the problem is Japan is so blinded with their power that they cannot see beyond their blinders. And they're not seeing that as they move forward down this path, these outside factors are going to close in on them if they're not careful. And that's the problem, is they don't recognize these outside factors. And eventually they just go on with their plan. But guess what's going to happen? Those blinders are going to come off after this plan is initiated, and they're going to see that, we just awoke the beast, basically. So December 7th, 1941, we see 180 Japanese planes attack the Navy base at Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii, which has been there since the 1800s, late 1800s, like 1897. And so over 2,400 are killed, 12 ships sunk, 188 aircraft are destroyed, and we see they're hit by 4 torpedoes. And the USS Oklahoma was one of the first battleships sunk, with 429 men on board were killed. And sadly, a lot of men could not get out in time and fortunately sunk with the ships. The United States joined the Allied powers just 3 days later. They declared war on Japan, and ultimately what you see happening is that the United States would, when they would declare war on Japan, then that would also lead Germany to declare war on us. Okay, so what does Oklahoma do? We get involved in this climate of mobilizing, getting ready for war, and we see that we kind of put together a workforce, kind of getting people to join in and work on arms and ammunition plants, work in arms and ammunition plants in military training centers. Obviously, men are joining war, so they're going off in training. Those who cannot join in the Army are starting to step in. We see in April of 1941, Oklahoma City named a site of supply and maintenance depot. Tinker Air Force Base is established, with Tinker Field opened in 1942. This helped create a community known as Midwest City, which is still there today and still is Tinker Air Force Base, as they're building certain planes for the Air Force. But you're also seeing Douglas aircraft built military planes at Tinker and also in Tulsa. So military aircraft was being built at this point in time, and we're seeing a lot of older men and men who were unable to join the Army or be accepted into the Army go into these factories. You're also seeing women. Rosie the Riveter playing a big part in this. Women play a huge part in the ability to provide the work or the resources needed to fight in war. We're seeing that other facilities were put up, 80 military facilities built in Oklahoma, including Camp Gruber, Cookson Hills near Bragg's, trained 45,000 troops, Air Corps Basic Flying School in Enid, where pilot training was held, Clinton Naval Air Station in Atlas Army Airfield as well. We also have the British Flying School, also in Oklahoma, located in Tulsa, Miami, and Ponca City. Then you also have United States Army, was associated with a almost failure training. U.S. Army almost accidentally bombed Boise City in Oklahoma in July of 1943. Kind of mistook the Dalhart Army Base in Texas, street lights around the courthouse as for their target. Nearly 200,000 Oklahomans enlisted for the war. 300,000 were drafted. Women joined the Army and the Navy as well. This is where we start to see that women are actually accepted into the military, mostly for nursing. We see that they're not there for combat. They're mostly there for nursing, and as well as other sort of jobs that are needed, whether clerical work or possibly to help build things as well. But you had the Women's Army Corps, the WAC, and other groups around this time. We see 45th Infantry Division of men from Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, known as the Thunderbirds. Over 20,000 of these men were killed. Sadly, 8 received Medal of Honor. 1 regiment helped liberate Dachau concentration camp. Bill Molden, the Thunderbird, who won the Pulitzer Prize for wartime cartoons. We see 90th Infantry, mostly from Texas and Oklahomans. The TO landed at the beach of Normandy, and also the Battle of the Bulge. Native Americans also served during this time as code talkers, the Navajo and the Comanche, which is your answer number 7. Now, World War II is not the only time that Native Americans actually helped create codes, messages. During this time, we see that there was a group. I'm going to fix this one because it's old. Native Americans. We see a group of Native Americans were used to code messages due to success of the method in World War One. We used Native American soldiers in World War One to provide the assistance in creating these codes because the Navajo language or the Comanche language or the other languages as well just were hard to break, whether in Europe or in the Pacific. So Navajo used theirs in the Pacific and the Army Marines, and then Comanche were assigned 4th Signal Company of the Army's 4th Infantry Division in Europe. Used unwritten language to transmit and receive messages. The codes of these unwritten languages remained unbroken. So Native American, the Japanese just could not break those codes. Many Japanese Americans, especially on the West Coast, were moved to relocation camps for the duration of the war. Government was sure of their loyalty to the United States. Fort Sill, McAllister, Stringtown were relocation camps in Oklahoma. We did have a prisoner of war camp also in Oklahoma, about 5,000 prisoners from Germany, Italy at Alva camp. So your answer number 3 is yes, we did have prisoner of war camps. While soldiers are at the war, others took over the job. Like I said, women took jobs as rosy riveters, taking jobs in factories where men were working at one point. There was victory gardens to help with the supplement the food supply because certain things were rationed. So they encouraged people to kind of start their own little gardens. Goods were rationed to make sure that there was enough to go around. Many patriotic movies and posters were big at this point in time. A lot of propaganda at this point in time of like, we're great, we're amazing, we're so awesome. Like comic books, for example, when you see a comic book during World War II, who is Superman fighting? Who is Batman or Wonder Woman fighting? They're fighting the Nazis. One of the biggest propaganda posters, or actually, I wouldn't say posters, but actual material was Captain America, because the first issue of Captain America, I believe it's the first issue, if I remember correctly, is Captain America is punching Adolf Hitler. And it's a great cover and it's awesome. But at the time that came out, it really made some isolationists really mad because that was before we even entered the war. And a lot of them thought that that was going to make Adolf Hitler mad and make Germany mad and them declaring war on us. So a lot of people were not happy with that version of propaganda. But that is in some ways propaganda because you also look at comic books. I mean, even though technically, yes, they're defending us against the fascists. What is really fascism? Fascism is getting your way through using violence, and that's kind of what our superheroes were doing. Is they were using violence to solve the world's problems. So, in some ways, in a sense, that's fascism. So, there's a bit of some mixed messaging going on with it, but definitely a lot of famous comic books during that time, and part of the reason why comic books are worth a lot of money now is because they printed a ton of copies back then. But guess what happened? Mom had to recycle the paper because they encouraged people to recycle paper, metals, whatever. And so mom would grab the comic book and throw it into the recycling pile. And so now some of those individuals who were able to save that comic book, guess what? There's less in circulation out there. And because there's less of them, that means the demand is high for them with the supply down. That means it's more money. So if you got that one, please let me know. I might buy it from you. Anyway, June 6th, 1944, D-Day, Allies began to attack the Axis in Normandy and France. We see that they basically stormed the beach in Normandy. If you watch Saving Private Ryan, you'll see that scene, very brutal. A lot of men died that day. But once they got past the Axis powers and got into Europe, it made it a lot easier to tackle the Nazis. And 3 million Allied troops poured in, and after 2 months, they liberated Paris. That march continued on in April 1945, and Allies captured Berlin, and the war in Europe was over, but not Japan. Now, the War in the Pacific was very brutal, probably more brutal than Europe. Everybody thinks, oh, Europe, oh man, that was a tough war. It was. No, look, it was. It was probably more brutal for the British and the French. Because when the United States came in, yeah, there was a few key wars and battles that, or a few key battles that were rough, but mostly once the United States entered Europe, it was knocking them down left and right. Oh, we got Italy. Oh, we got France. Oh, we made our way into Germany, and boom, we're done. Because the thing is, people forget Russia at that time was helping, and it made things, took the load off the United States. Whereas in the war in the Pacific, I mean, we did not have a lot of help. It was mostly the United States. Yes, Britain helped a little bit. But a lot of it was the United States, and we were fighting the Japanese, and we had to build our way back up because they had taken Midway, they had taken certain the Philippines, they had taken certain islands, even into Australia, to that really made it difficult. We had to recapture Australia and kind of build our way back up to get those islands. Eventually, it came towards. Eventually we got Midway back. We got all these other islands back to the Philippines. The problem is now to really end the war, we had to attack Japan. But the problem is that when they were looking at the numbers, they realized that there was going to be 1 million lives lost. That's American troops, Japanese troops, and citizens. And so the United States Army and the generals at the time were like, we can't afford to do this. We cannot afford to lose 1 million men. And so at the time this was happening, the Manhattan Project was going on, where there was a secret mission to create the nuclear bomb going out in New Mexico. And eventually they came to the agreement, we're going to drop the nuclear bomb in Japan, or the atomic bomb. And what ends up happening is that Truman warns Japan, we're going to drop a bomb if you do not surrender. But basically, Japan is very prideful. They're like, nope, we're not going to do it. And eventually, boom, they killed over 50,000 in Hiroshima. They sent out another warning. Now, this one, I don't know for sure if Nagasaki got the warning in time, but either way, Nagasaki was the next city that was destroyed. After the atomic bomb dropped, over 50,000 people died there. In total, over 100,000 had died. And eventually, after the second bomb, Japan said, we're done. We surrender. It's over. And luckily, luckily, only 100,000 died. Sadly, 100,000 died because of 2 bombs. It's definitely one of Harry Truman, which is your answer number 8, is one of the most, probably one of the more controversial decisions in the history of all presidents. When Truman made that call, but again, war is difficult. It's hard to always determine what the right thing is sometimes. But more than 62 million were killed throughout the whole war. Only 6,000 Oklahomans died. But that is it for the war, for World War II. And as far as Oklahoma goes, we're going to talk in section 2 more about kind of what happens afterwards with the war over. How's that help not just America, but Oklahoma specifically? And we'll kind of get into those details in the next section. So see you then.